Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're taking a deeper dive into selective mutism. We're going to break down exactly what it is, take away the massive misconceptions that surround it, and talk about what's actually happening in the brain when words just won't come out. Let's start with the definition, because the name itself is actually a bit of a historical mistake. Selective mutism is a complex childhood anxiety disorder affecting 1 in 140 students, characterized by a child's inability to speak in select social settings, like a school or public place, despite being completely capable of speaking completely comfortably and fluently in other settings, like at home with their parents. Notice how I said inability, and I didn't say refusal. Despite what the name implies, the word selective does not mean a person is choosing when to speak. A more accurate term used by modern experts is situational mutism. Selective mutism is not a behavioral problem or a speech defect. It is a severe anxiety disorder. When a person with this condition enters a stressful social environment, their brain's threat detection system goes into overdrive. It triggers a physical freeze response. Their vocal cords are completely functional, but intense anxiety literally paralyzes their ability to speak. It is an autopilot survival mechanism, and not a conscious choice. While selective mutism can affect adolescents and adults, it almost always begins in early childhood, usually surfacing around age 5 and when a child enters preschool or kindergarten. It is relatively rare, affecting less than 1% of the population. The symptoms can take a few different forms. For some, it is a total inability to communicate, accompanied by stiff posture and avoidance of eye contact. And for others, it looks like a reliance on nonverbal workarounds. They might whisper frantically to a trusted parent, point to pictures, or limit themselves to simple sounds like uh-huh or uh-uh. In a classroom setting, this can become distressing. Some children will suffer through pain or full bladder because they are physically unable to ask a teacher for help. So why does this happen? While experts are still researching the exact causes, we know it is deeply intertwined with other mental health conditions. Between 75% and 100% of people with selective mutism also meet the criteria for social anxiety disorder. There's also a strong genetic link. Anxiety often runs in families, and a child with selective mutism is much more likely to have a close relative who struggles with anxiety. In other cases, it can be triggered by underlying speech delays, environmental trauma, bilingualism, or the stress of immigrating to a new place with an entirely new primary language. So now let's dive into how we actually got here, because the history of this diagnosis reads like a medical detective story where doctors spent 100 years chasing the wrong culprit. The very first recorded description of this behavior goes all the way back to 1877. A German physician named Adolf Kussmaul was tracking children who were entirely capable of speaking fluently at home, but suddenly became totally silent when they entered a clinic, a school, or a public space. Because medicine at the time didn't have a very robust framework for child anxiety disorders, Kussmaul assumed it was a deliberate choice of willpower. He labeled it aphasia voluntaria, which literally translates to voluntary speechlessness. Think of how heavy that label is. Right from the start line of the 19th century, medical literature framed these children not as frightened, but as stubborn people. It sent a message to doctors and teachers that the silence was an act of quiet rebellion. Now let's fast forward to 1934. A Swiss psychiatrist named Moritz Tramer decided aphasia wasn't the right word, since these children didn't have brain damage. He updated the term to elective mutism. While it sounded a bit more clinical, it carried over the exact same fundamental flaw. The word elective implies an election, like a choice. The prevailing theory for the mid-20th century, heavily influenced by early psychoanalysis, was that these children were withholding their voices as a coping mechanism for household trauma, overprotective parenting, or a deep-seated desire to manipulate the adults around them. Because of this elective framework, the early interventions were often adversarial or punitive. Adults tried to crack the child's silence through standoffs, like refusing to give a child water or food until they spoke. Isolation, like keeping a student back from recess until they read aloud. Or even shaming, publicly pointing out the silence to force a breakthrough. Of course, we now know that this did the exact opposite. It just fueled an ongoing, already raging fire of internal anxiety and made many kids try to be more silent, locking their vocal cords even tighter. The real breakthrough didn't happen until 1994, when the American Psychiatric Association published the DSM-4, or the fourth edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. After decades of clinical observation and a growing understanding of neuroscience, researchers proved that these children weren't defiant. They were terrified. The condition was officially renamed selective mutism. The switch from elective to selective was so monumental. It took the blame off the child. It signaled to the world that mutism depends entirely on the selection of the environment. For example, quiet and expressive at home, but entirely frozen and quiet at school, and not as an act of willful choice. Today, in the current DSM-5, selective mutism isn't even classified under disorders of infancy or childhood anymore. It was moved into anxiety disorders category, right alongside social anxiety disorder and specific phobias. Modern neuroimaging shows us exactly why that move was the right move. When someone with selective mutism enters an environment where speech is expected, their amygdala instantly sounds the alarm. It flags a simple question like, "What's your name?" as an existential threat, triggering an immediate sympathetic nervous system shutdown. Think of the amygdala from our previous episode, the brain's smoke detector for danger. In an individual with selective mutism, the amygdala misinterprets a normal social interaction as an actual physical threat. The brain signals this freeze response, and the vocal cords literally tense up. It is an involuntarily physical shutdown, not a behavioral choice. Because selective mutism is an invisible-ish condition, it is a magnet for a lot of bad assumptions, in a sense. So let's talk about the 4 biggest misconceptions that people like educators, extended family, and much of the public often get wrong. Misconception 1. They're just incredibly shy. They'll grow out of it. Shyness is a normal personality trait. A shy child might take 10 or 15 minutes to warm up in a new room, but they will eventually adapt, look at people, and communicate. Selective mutism is a debilitating anxiety freeze. Without targeted behavioral intervention, children simply do not grow out of it. Instead, the habit of silence reinforces itself over time, making it harder to break out as they get older. Misconception 2. It's a power struggle. They're being defiant or manipulative. This is perhaps the most damaging myth. Parents and teachers sometimes think, well, they talk at home, so they clearly are just withholding speech at school to be like stubborn or trying to draw attention to themselves or control the room. In reality, the child is actually desperate to speak. If you look closely, a child frozen by selective mutism often exhibits stiff posture, a blank facial expression, or avoids eye contact. They aren't trying to control you. They're trying to manage an overwhelming wave of internal panic. Misconception 3. It must be the result of severe trauma or abuse. For decades, people assumed a silent child must be hiding a dark secret at home. While trauma can cause sudden mutism, this is also known as traumatic mutism. Selective mutism is fundamentally an anxiety disorder. Research shows it is heavily linked to genetics and a family history of social anxiety or severe shyness. The vast majority of children with SM, or selective mutism, come from a loving, supportive home. Misconception 4. If I just force them or offer a big enough reward, they'll speak. Pressure is often the fuel for even more anxiety. For example, if you offer a child $100 to speak, or if you refuse to give them their lunch until they say please, you're just skyrocketing that kind of anxiety. And when anxiety goes up, the vocal cords get even tighter in this really anxious individual. So if you're going to take something away from this, know that coercion makes selective mutism worse and not better. So if pressure doesn't work, what actually does? The gold standard for treating selective mutism is a combination of cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, and specialized behavioral techniques, specifically faded or graded exposure and stimulus fading. Instead of demanding a full sentence right away, therapists and trained parents use a step-by-step ladder. First, the child might start by communicating through nonverbal gestures like pointing or nodding. Second, they might move to making sounds, pointing to a picture while make a buzzing sound, for example. Step 3, they might whisper a single word to a trusted person with no one else in the room. Step 4, they gradually fade into new people and louder volumes in the space. Another crucial tool is changing how we ask questions. Instead of asking open-ended questions like, what do you want to eat? Which often requires a lot of processing and creates high pressure. You can use forced choice questions like, do you want an apple or a banana? This gives the child a specific, predictable script to copy, and this lowers the cognitive load of speaking. And so, if there's one thing to take away from this entire episode, it's that the silence is not always a choice. And when you meet someone who cannot speak in a social setting, the best thing that you can do is to lower the pressure. Don't comment on their silence. Don't make a massive scene if they finally manage to whisper a word, and treat them with the same warmth and normalcy that you would give to anyone else, allowing them to feel that this space is safe for you. Because safety is basically the only key that can unlock much of the vocal cords that are tightened in their throat. So thank you for listening to this episode of Unmuted. See you next time.